Good. If you want to catch up on this first part of this lecture, you'll have to go listen to it on what I call the YouTubes, because it's up there. So we won't go back through it. But we've been talking about the Reformation, and we talked about previously Martin Luther. We talked about John Calvin. We talked about a guy with an interesting name named Ulrich Zwingli. Perhaps you can name your firstborn son Ulrich. Why not? I told you there's some good names here. Ulrich is a good one. Now, this actually turns into fighting. And so this I already talked about, so I won't continue on with it. But I do want to talk about another group. Another group. Remember, when we start this Reformation period, or just prior to it, there really is only one church in Western Europe. And that's what we would call the Roman Catholic Church, right? Today. The church centered in Rome. And that was it. So if you lived in Germany or France or Italy, Spain, England, that was the only church there was. So when Martin Luther starts this idea and is able to survive and actually have other churches in Germany, that was a very radical thing. That there were now churches affiliated with Luther, which come to be called Lutheran churches. Other churches in Switzerland, which typically come to be known as Reformed churches, or the Reformed movement. Okay? Now, once that door is open, to new churches, guess what? We're going to get a whole bunch of them. We're going to get a whole bunch of different groups. For example, now you guys don't even know what a phone book is, right? You don't even have phone books. Right? Well, maybe. Some of you still might see a phone book. But they used to have phone books where they listed everything, and they had yellow pages where they listed all the stuff in the back. Now I guess it would be Google. Like if you went to Google and you Googled, can somebody get the door for her there? Can you open that door up for her? Maybe move that chair. Move that chair right there. There we go. There we go. Thank you. So, if you went to what I call the Google, and you typed in there Lakeland, Florida, churches, and you did a search, how many different kinds of churches do you think you would find? Somebody's going to Google it and tell me they have 9,337 entries. But I'm talking about different kinds of churches. What sort of groups would you find? Let me ask you that. Let's say just in Lakeland. Lakeland's what? We've got about 100,000 people. We're going to have Lutherans. We're going to have Roman Catholics. What else are we going to have? Protestant's very general, but yes. But under the category of Protestant, what would we have? Baptists, yes. Oh, let me tell you, there's all kinds of Baptists. There are probably 40 different kinds of Baptist churches. They're not just one. You got Southern Baptists, American Baptists, you got Free Will Baptists, you got Hard-Shelled Baptists, you got, my favorite are the Shiite Baptists. You got to watch out for them, the Shiite Baptists, very radical. I just made that one up. Shiite Muslims. I did meet a guy who, I called him a Shiite Baptist because he had been a Baptist and then he became a Shiite Muslim. So I call him the Shiite Baptist, which even a lot of the Muslims didn't know what to do with him. And certainly the Christians didn't know what to do with the guy. So I call him the Shiite Baptist. But, he was a nice enough guy. A little strange, a little different, but that's okay. Yeah, so we're going to have Baptists. We'll have Lutherans. How about Presbyterians? You ever heard of them? Episcopalians? All right. What else?
Assemblies of God.
Assemblies of God, sure. We ought to come up with that. I mean, the school here is affiliated with the Assemblies of God, right? So, Assemblies of God. There's various kinds of Pentecostal churches. There would be then non-denominational or whatever, groups. There's all kinds of groups, okay? We don't need to list them all. But where did all those groups come from? They came from the Protestant Reformation because there was only one back then. All right, then we got two. We got the Lutherans and then we got the Reformed. Now we got three. right? Roman Catholic, Lutherans, and Reformed. Now we're going to talk about a fourth group that's going to give rise to several other groups. These are called the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists actually begin in Switzerland, coming out of the group that Ulrich Zwingli started. And by the way, their name is Anabaptizo. Remember, baptizo means to immerse or to plunge or to dip, literally in Greek. And ana in Greek means again, repeated. So you're going to be baptized again. Now, it's not that the Anabaptists practice being baptized again, as saying, well, everybody needs to be baptized more than once. But that was practically what was happening. Because remember, since the Roman Catholics and the Reforms and the Lutherans all baptized in some way infants, right? Usually by sprinkling. That means that if you were born, let's say in 1500, let's just round it off, around 1500, there's about a 100% chance if you were born in 1500 in Germany or Switzerland or France, that you would be baptized, christened, sprinkled within the first couple of weeks of your life. Usually that happened pretty fast. As soon as you had kind of recovered and your mother had sort of recovered from the whole process, it would be set up at the church and you would go and there would be a ceremony and there would be this baptism. So what that means is if later in your life, let's say when you get to be in your 20s, right, 1523, 1522, 1524, you get to be 22, 23, 24, you say, you know what? I don't know if I really believe all the things that my parents believed. And you might even become convinced that you needed not to be sprinkled, but you need to be baptized not as an infant, but as somebody who understands what's going on. Remember I told you about baptism, it gets complicated. First of all, it's complicated because we don't translate the word. It's a church word that we don't translate. We transliterate it. Baptism is an English word, but it comes from the Greek word baptizo. So we don't really translate it, right? What the word literally means in Greek is to dip or to plunge or to immerse. And they often use it of, say, fabric. If you're going to dye fabric, you'd have to dip it down into the dye, that sort of thing. You would use baptizo for that, so forth. So anyway, we don't even translate the word. Secondly, there's so many different ways that people approach it because there's sort of three different elements to baptism that maybe you don't even think about. First of all is who should be baptized or who are we going to baptize? And that generally falls into two big groups. Babies, infants, those are very young who obviously don't know what's going on. A 2-week-old baby doesn't really just knows it's getting wet. It does not know the spiritual implications of the baptism, right? Or those who do understand. Some people call them believers, believers' baptism. You know who Christ is, you believe in Christ, you choose to be baptized. The infant does not choose. Okay? So that's the subject. Who is going to be baptized? Then there is the mode. That is the how. How are you going to be baptized? There's usually three different ways. Sprinkling, pouring, or immersing the person. Okay? Now, typically, infants are not ever immersed. Except, interestingly enough, Greek Orthodox churches immerse babies. How do they do it? Well, they use that idea of dipping. They sort of take the baby, and they kind of swoosh it through the water, but it gets completely covered. Okay? Why? I think because the Greek Orthodox people understand Greek. And they know they're supposed to dip or plunge for baptism. So they do that in infants. But everybody else who baptizes infants, everybody else I know, they either sprinkle or pour. Sprinkle just means put a little bit of water, sprinkle it on, usually on the forehead or head. Pour, sometimes they'll take a pitcher, kind of pour it over the head of the baby, right? Now, those three styles, I guess, could happen to an adult, but they almost always happen to the infant, is that it's sprinkling or pouring. All right, or immersion. And then there's a third thing that we usually never talk about, and that's why. So who gets baptized, how do they get baptized, and then why are you baptized? That's the meaning of baptism. Remember, Martin Luther said infants should be sprinkled, but it brought about efficacious grace and salvation. We mentioned that earlier. Whereas the Reformed people were sprinkling babies, and they said, no, it's not efficacious, it's just a symbol, it's just an outward sign. Now, the Anabaptists are going to come along, and they're going to say, you know what? We don't accept infants being baptized. So we're over here in this category. Believers' baptism, and it's not sprinkling or pouring, it's immersion. And this was considered to be completely radical. Now, at first, Zwingli kind of went along with it. Why? Because he didn't like to have anything that was like what the Roman Catholics had. Since the Roman Catholics sprinkled infants, Zwingli toyed with the idea of immersing adults. But when he started to think about it, he said, no way. Why did he reject it? Got any ideas? What kind of church is he trying to set up through the city of Zurich? Remember, Zwingli's in Zurich. Well, yeah, it's not really, it's not really Lutheran. You're right, it's Protestant kind of church, but how does he want it to be governed? Who runs the church?
The state, right?
Yeah, the state, the city councils in Switzerland. The city council of Zurich pretty much ran the church, or you might put it the other way around. The church council ran the city. So we mentioned this, I don't know, last week. And what that means is that the church might say, you know what, we think everybody ought to go to church every Sunday. Radical, isn't it? Then I found out here at Southeastern, I guess there's no official rule. People were very vocal about this point. When I asked this question, I got a lot of answers. It was not silence. I said, are you required to go to church each Sunday? And they said, no. Nowhere in the handbook says we have to go to church. We have to go to chapel 20 times or get 20 chapel credits, which is not the same thing. What I'm finding out. What's that?
30.
Oh, 30. Well, then I mean some people only do 10, some people do 20. I don't know. Anyway, whatever. 30 times. But church, they don't check up on you, right? If you slept in every Sunday in your dorm room and slept till noon, didn't go to church, you would only have peer pressure of your roommates or something. No school official is going to keep track of that. Well, let's say they did. Let's say in this case the city council does. And if you don't show up, they're taking attendance, kind of like the way we keep your chapel credits, right? I assume they do that when you swipe your ID card. Is that how they do it? They swipe your ID card and then they keep track if you showed up or not? I don't know. I assume that's how they do it. You don't know either, so maybe you need to work on those 30 because we only got a few days left. Anyway, but that's what they would do. And if you didn't show up, then what would happen is, well, you get called in. And you could be punished. You would be fined. You see, if you didn't show up to church, they would come saying, hey, you weren't at church last Sunday. That's bad because it's Easter, especially. And you weren't there. And were you sick? Were you out of town visiting relatives and you went to church with them? And if you said, no, I just didn't feel like going to church. I was tired. I stayed up all night watching Netflix and playing Xbox. or whatever else it is you guys play. And I just didn't feel like doing it. And they say, well, you have to go. And so we're going to charge you a fine. $50, whatever. All right? Got to make it enough that you pay attention. $50, let's say. Now, let's say the next week you didn't go again. Well, then the fine might go up. But I tell you what, if you make a habit of not going, what they're going to do is going to move from being a fine to a physical punishment. You could be put into jail, but more likely what's going to happen is they're going to put you in the stocks. You know what the stocks are, right? You've seen those. So you have your head, put your head and your arms in there, and they lock the thing down so you can't get out. And they always make it so you got to bend over so it's uncomfortable, because they don't want it to be comfortable. And then above your head on that thing, they're going to write what you did wrong or what you didn't do. And then they're going to put you in a very public place. Like here on campus, it'd probably be out in front of the one of the fountains, or maybe out along the main drag out here, right? Or maybe down there by the cafeteria. Well, we don't call it the cafeteria. We want it somewhere where everybody walks by, where a lot of people walk by. And you're going to have to do that maybe for several days, just to make sure everybody sees you and you know that what you've done is very wrong. So that's making the church run the state, and that means that the church is going to have the power to punish you. Now, because of that, Zwingli is going to, you thought I was completely off track, which often I am, but this stuff relates to what we're talking about at least, not like a lot of my stories. But the reason I bring it up here is this. Zwingli decides he can't go with believers' baptism because he wants this state church, for the church to run the state. And guess what? If everybody is baptized within, say, a few days that they're born, that means that all the rules of the church apply to you your whole life. See? From the time you're 5 days old or whatever, 10 days old, you're a member of the church. You got to do what the church wants. Now, of course, when you're a few months old, it's not a problem. But when you get to be 15 and you haven't decided you wanted to be baptized, or when you get to be 18, or when you get to be 20 or 25, you can have people running around for many, many years not being a member of the church. And then what? They don't go to church, and they say, well, I'm not a Christian. I don't belong to the church. I don't have to follow your Christian rules. Zwingli did not like that. So Zwingli switched his mind on it, and he said, you know what? We're going to stick with baptism of infants. We're not going to go with this other thing. Now, the guy who works with him, the guy pictured here, is named Conrad. There's a good name for your child, Conrad. Conrad Grebel. Conrad. Very few people named Conrad these days. I think we ought to bring that name back. I kind of like it. Conrad Grebel. Well, he knows Zwingli, and he's been kind of encouraging. He's bringing up this idea of believers' baptism, and Zwingli's kind of going along with it at first. But then Zwingli says, no. Conrad Grebel goes his own way. He says, well, sorry, Ulrich. Conrad says, sorry, Ulrich. I hold to this. I think this is true. And I guess who else really liked it? People that were lower class. Poorer people really liked this idea. Why do you think poorer people would rather have believers' baptism than infant baptism? Can you think of any reasons? You didn't know it was going to be an oral exam today. Take a stab at it. Just think about it. Imagine you're a poor person in 1520s, and you've got this state church. Who do you think's running the state church? Poor people? No, right? Rich people. This means the rich people run the city council, and the rich people run the church council, and the rich people tell you what to do. And if you say, you know what? I don't want to be I don't want to follow your rules. You don't care about me. I want to choose for myself. And so a lot of poorer people who felt like they were not a part of the government, not a part of the decisions, they said, we want to make one decision for ourselves. And that decision is when we decide to be baptized. And how we decide to be baptized. So that's true. That's what happens. Now, by the way, the Reformed, people who ran the Reform movement, did not like that at all. It's rebellious. And you're rebelling against the church, you're rebelling against the government. You know what they did to some of these people? You know what they did to Conrad Grebel? They took him out. They did this to more than just him. They took him out. They said, you know what? You want to be immersed, buddy? We're going to immerse you. Took him out to the middle of the lake, tied him up, put weights around him, threw him in the lake. You will be immersed. That'll be the last thing you do. Conrad Grebel at the bottom of some lake in Switzerland. Well, people got violent, is what I'm saying. Now, in fact, poorer people, when they begin to see the Reformation happen, this is another issue where it gets a little more political, but it deals with the religion. The poorer people see, okay, somebody like Martin Luther, Zwingli, and these guys say, we don't have to follow the Pope. We don't have to follow the Roman Catholic Church. We're going to have our own church. It doesn't take too much for somebody to take the ideas of rebelling against the church to rebelling against the state. Now here's something to think about. The most ways that a church is run, I don't know if you ever think about how a church is organized or run. And I don't know how the church is organized that you attend. But I can take a stab at it. It typically parallels, it typically reflects the kind of government that you have in that country. Now, not here in the United States, a bit of an exception. But here in the United States, most churches in the United States are very independent. They're very locally autonomous. I don't know about churches where you attend, but a lot of churches where I attend, we have congregational votes. You ever heard of a congregational vote? You ever vote on your leaders, like an elder or deacons or stuff, where the church gets to vote? There's nominations. We have nominations, and then we have elections. Where is your chapter and verse in the Bible for that one? You're not going to find it, because it's not in there. You can look and see, check it out. If you find it, let me know. I'd like to see it. But I've not found it. What does that mean? That means that we do our church government a lot like we do our U.S. government. We have nominations. We have elections. We have church boards. We usually have like elders and deacons or something like that. And then they make the decisions. There are representatives. Right? We have a representational form of church government. Now, I'm not here to debate what kind of church government we ought to have. I'm just saying that in Europe at this time, they had kings and they had princes and they had emperors. And guess what? The Roman Catholic Church had a king, so to speak, had a top ruler, the Pope. And so if we're going to get rid of the Pope as our ruler, then maybe we ought to get rid of the king or the duke or the prince or the emperor. Why should we have that? Why don't we have more democracy? If we're going to have more democracy in the church, we should have more democracy in the state. And so that's what happens. A lot of peasants revolt. They revolt. And these Anabaptists revolt. And their revolts are suppressed severely. The peasants' revolts that take place, say, in 1524, 1525, they come down hard on these peasants. In fact, Martin Luther, I think, probably, this is one thing he regretted in his life. So when the peasants started to revolt and the princes wanted to do something about it, they asked for Martin Luther's opinion. And Martin Luther said, yes, we need to have law and order. And the princes, I mean, they killed a lot of peasants. And later on, I think Martin Luther thought that had gone too far, right? So it's suppressed. And the Anabaptists are a part of that, and Anabaptists are suppressed. Now remember, in Germany you had sections that were Roman Catholic, cities that were Roman Catholic, and cities that were Lutheran. In Switzerland you had city councils that ran things. And so you know what the Anabaptists decided they needed? Since everybody was oppressing them? They said, we need our own city. So they actually formed a sort of ragtag army, and they attacked the city of Munster. I mean, they attacked it. And they took it over. Their leader was a guy named John Leyden. So this is what sort of gave Anabaptists a bad name with a lot of people, because John Leyden was very radical and very violent. And he also sort of fancied himself almost what we might call a cult leader today. That he was the main guy, and that everybody should follow him, and he kind of made up the rules he was going. Because remember, Anabaptists didn't have a whole lot of education. These are peasants. But John Leyden started to follow, pick and choose some of the things he kind of liked out of the Old Testament, like having multiple wives. He had multiple wives. Remember, Abraham had multiple wives. And other people in the Old Testament had multiple wives. He kind of liked that idea. And so he did. Polygamy was something that he taught. He also used force, violence. He also sort of believed the world was going to end very soon. End times or apocalyptic kind of stuff. And so he sort of felt like he was the guy that was ushering in a new age or whatever. Okay? So you need to have that kind of mindset. He was sort of thinking like he was special, this is a special time, and people need to listen to me, and we're going to use violence. And they took the city of Munster. He had other, like polygamy and other practices like that. Well, there's not too much. There's not too much that Roman Catholics and Lutherans can agree upon at this time. Right? They fought each other. They don't like each other. But the one thing they could agree about? They didn't like the Anabaptists. So in fact, the Roman Catholics and the Lutherans ganged up on Munster and the Anabaptists. They attacked the city to take it back. And they take back the city, and they brutally began to wipe out the radical element, the Anabaptists. Those in the city. And this gave the Anabaptists then a bad name, right? That they were violent and so forth. But the movement did not stop there. Had the movement stopped there, we would probably even be talking about it in this class. But it didn't. Because one of the guys who was in the Anabaptist movement had a brother who was actually a priest. And he died. But his brother, who was a priest, began to take note of the Anabaptists, and he began to understand part of what the Anabaptists were doing. And in fact, he agreed with a lot of what they were talking about. This idea that you should have a choice and that you should choose, and baptism and so forth. And so even though he had been trained as a priest, his name was Menno Simons, he was a Roman Catholic priest. Therefore, within their group, highly educated, he will convert to an Anabaptist view and will quickly become a leader because of his education and his background. So much so that many of those who follow, many Anabaptists who follow his way of thinking began to be called by his name. Have you ever heard of the Mennonites? They are named for Menno Simons. I think it would be better if they called the Simonites. Then people don't think they're car wax. but they're Mennonites, okay? Mennonites. Mennonites that are Anabaptists. And what Menno Simons will bring them to is not only, of course, supporting adult baptism and congregational rule, that is, each congregation rules itself. He did not like the violence that had occurred at Munster, and so he takes them down a road of pacifism, so that the Mennonites today are known sometimes as the Peace Church or as pacifists. And very famously, Mennonites do not want to get involved with government. The separation of church and state, you can trace it back to the Mennonites, really. Because the Reformed, they want to merge it together. The Mennonites say, no, we need to separate the church and the state. They also began something that really hadn't been a practice in the church. That's foot washing. They would have, I think it's every quarter, they have communion every quarter, but every quarter they also wash each other's feet. And they have what they call an agape meal, a love feast, a love meal where they have some food. And pretty much are trying to imitate the Lord's Supper. You remember on the night when Jesus goes to the upper room and they washed he washed their feet, and then they had some food, and then he had the Last Supper, we call it, or communion. They try to sort of reenact that, okay? Which was a little different at that time. You know, I don't know if you've ever been involved in foot washing, but what I suspect that people do before the foot washing, a lot of people, is they make sure they wash their feet. So if you know I'm going to church this Sunday, we're going to be washing each other's feet, I want to make sure my feet are clean, and I got on nice clean socks, and I polish up my shoes, right? But of course, that kind of defeats the purpose, right? Jesus washed dirty feet. But if I was involved in washing other people's feet, I would probably appreciate that they took the time to take a shower or something before church. But anyway, there we have it. So that's Menno Simons. Now they also, from that, they tried to separate themselves from the world to be a peculiar people, as Peter tells us to be. You know, Peter in his epistle said, be a peculiar people. And some people I meet really take that one to heart, because they're really kind of strange. But of course it means we should stand out from the crowd. And the way they decide to stand out from the crowd is to stay about, 200 years behind times. So some of the Mennonites are called Amish. You ever have any Amish around here in Florida? I don't know, I probably made it down here too much. This is just where the Amish come for vacation. They come to Florida. I remember one time I was staying at a place near a beach, and right across from me was a whole building full of Amish people. When they go out to swim, and like a full lady in a full dress. Anyway. Amish. So the Amish are a branch of the Mennonites. And there are different orders of Amish. Some are more conservative or strict than others. We're not going to go into all of that. But part of the idea is simple dress, simple life, and to separate yourself. All right, let's move on. That's another group. And out of the Anabaptists then come the Mennonites, the Amish, several other groups like that. Now, let's talk about what happens in England, shall we? Okay. Hey, what happened in England? I'm glad you asked. The English Reformation is completely different than the German Reformation. It's completely different than what happened in Switzerland. Whereas, Luther was just a scrappy monk who didn't really have much power. And that's pretty much the way these other groups started. It started from the bottom up with a grassroots movement, we call it. But the English Reformation starts from the top down. It begins with this guy pictured here. His name is Henry VIII. There's an old song, you have to look it up. It's called Henry VIII, I Am. Henry VIII, I Am. Well, you'll have to look it up for yourself. Basically, it's about a woman who marries 8 guys named Henry. And so he was the 8th one. This is supposed to be a funny song. So it's not this Henry VIII. But this Henry VIII, of course, reigns, as you can see, in the same time period, 1509 to 1547. And at one time, the Roman Catholic Pope gave him the title Defender of the Faith because he wrote against Luther and the Protestants. Now, he might have well had somebody else write it and he just signed his name to it, but we won't debate that here. At any rate, he was called Defender of the Roman Catholic Faith, which is a bit ironic because in a few years he's going to leave the Roman Catholic, spoiler alert, he's going to leave the Roman Catholic Church. In 1521, he writes against Martin Luther. But here's what happens. Henry had a wife. Now, Henry's wife did not produce a son. Okay? She had produced, given birth to, give issue, there's another word for it, gave issue to a female. Her name was Mary. So Mary was the firstborn child. The wife's name was Catherine. All right? So anyway, Henry starts to thinking, they thought at that time that the gender of the children and the whole thing about whether you could have a child or not was really all up to the woman. It wasn't the guy. It was the woman. The woman couldn't have children, or the woman couldn't have boys. She only had girls. And of course, to add to that, Henry had kind of met somebody else, if you know what I'm talking about. I think it was on the Tinder thing or something. He had swiped, which way he swiped, right or whatever. Anyway, her name was Anne. And so he's still married to Catherine, but then he kind of meets this Anne, and he kind of likes Anne. Anne's younger, very pretty, looks like the kind of woman that's going to give birth to boys. So he decides that that's what's going to happen. Now, the problem is, he's married to Catherine. For him, that's the problem, because he wants to be with somebody else. So he goes to the Pope and he asks the Pope for an annulment. An annulment is sort of erasing out your marriage. It's not divorce, technically, although there's very little difference. But legally, as far as for him, he has to have legitimate children to be his heir. So if he has a child with Anne, and he's not married to Anne, then that child can't become the next king. People will challenge it. All right? Illegitimate child. Now, he wants an annulment. Now, sometimes I think people think the fact that he wanted an annulment is terrible, which, maybe it is, but that it's very unusual, which it's not. Important people got annulments quite often. It was not unusual for a king or an important person to go to the Pope or some other church official and ask for an annulment. That happened, I won't say every day, but it did happen. Now, the problem here is the person which Henry is married, Catherine, is related to the crown of Spain, which of course is part of the reason he's married. There's a long story there too we don't have time to go into, right? In fact, Catherine was married to Henry's brother. His brother dies, and that marriage had been arranged by his father, Henry VII. And his brother then was supposed to become the next king, but then his brother dies. This leaves this woman, Catherine, that his father had arranged to merge Spain and England's influence through this marriage, and now the guy dies. And now suddenly Henry, who was never supposed to be the king, not only has to become the king, but he's got to also, his father says, you have to marry Catherine. He doesn't really want to marry Catherine. I don't know what Catherine thinks about it, but Henry isn't all that enthused. Okay, so I think maybe that might make Henry not seem quite as mean. He didn't really want to marry her in the first place. And she's older than him, and they have a daughter, and now he meets someone younger, and now he wants a son. So he wants an annulment. And what does he say? He said, look, according to the Bible, I shouldn't have to marry my brother's wife. That's wrong. The Bible says you shouldn't marry your brother's wife. So he tries to use that as his rationale. Basically, the Pope says no. Why? Because he needs the leader of Spain to protect him. Catherine was from Aragon. Aragon, and she's connected to Philip, the King of Spain. He wants to marry the young and lovely Anne Boleyn. All right, so we don't have time to go into all of Henry's wives and all the things that happens to him. But this first one here is what prompts him leaving the church. Because the Pope won't grant his annulment, so you know what he just says? You know what? Lutherans have their own church. Reformed have their own church. I'm a king. I'm not just some monk. England's going to have its own church. We're going to call it what? The Church of England. And who's going to run it? Me. The king runs the church. And the church is just for England. So it's known as the Church of England or the Anglican Church. Here in the United States, we call it the Episcopal Church. We don't start calling that until the Revolutionary War, because it was kind of hard to say you were a member of the Church of England when you're fighting a war against England for independence. So we now call it the Episcopal Church. So what happens then? The Pope says no annulment, there's political pressure. And so in 1532, Henry VIII, I am, passes through what was called the Act of Supremacy in 1532. This Act of Supremacy then makes Henry the supreme head of the Church o' England. That's an Irish joke. No? Oh, never mind. He's the supreme leader, head of the Church of England. And it's still that way today, by the way. Still that way today. This is why people got very concerned when Charles divorced Diana, because they weren't supposed to divorce. And Charles will be the next ruler of England if his mother ever dies. I think Charles is saying she's never going to die. And she's never going to, I don't think she's ever going to step down. So I think she's going to stay. She's now the longest ruling monarch ever of England. And doesn't look to me like she's getting ready. Although people were worried last Christmas, but she didn't make her normal things, and she kind of got sick, and people thought that was it. Someday, if and when that happens, Charles will become king of England. And then after him, it'll be his son. And after him, it'll be his son's son, and so forth. Okay? But, in this case, still today, officially, the monarch of England is the leader of the Church of England. Now, Henry has an interesting life. He ends up having 6 wives, a couple of which he removes of the burden of their head, including Anne, by the way, the one who had sparked the whole divorce or annulment. New church. He later accuses Anne of not being faithful and has her beheaded in the Tower of London. His last wife, of course, outlives him. Now, one of his wives survived. I mean, she left. So, he didn't kill all of his wives. Catherine certainly lived. His last wife lived. There were a couple there in the middle that, well, we're not going to go through it all. A couple of them had their lives ended. There were 2 Catherines, by the way. That's why it gets a little confusing. But we don't have time to go through all that. Now, so he had a daughter with Catherine. Her name was Mary. He has a daughter with Anne. What's her name? Elizabeth, of course. And then, from another wife, he has a son, calls him Edward. And then you see this macho-looking guy right here. That's Edward. That's not Elizabeth. Sometimes I put this picture up and say, oh, that's Elizabeth. No, that's Edward right there. He's very macho. He was always kind of frail. He was always kind of pale. He was always sort of sickly. And by the way, he doesn't last long. After his father dies, he is just a teenager, and he will only rule for 6 years. During that time, he doesn't really rule. He has 2 uncles, and that's a long story. But they make the church very Protestant. Whereas Henry VIII just sort of removed the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church, but he kept pretty much all the doctrine. He kept all the ways they did things, the way they did communion, the way they did church services, the way they organized everything. Everything was the same except no pope. But when Edward comes to power, he's under the influence of a couple uncles, one more Protestant than the other, and they make it a truly Protestant church. Now what happens? Edward dies when he's 22 or something, very young. No heirs, so guess what? Guess who's now the heir? His oldest sister, Mary. Now imagine this. Mary knows that an entire church was started because she wasn't a boy. She was a woman. She was a girl, right? Had she been male, her mother would not have been put away, and she would not have been sent off to France, and she would have been right there ruling England this whole time, and a whole church was started. So to say that Mary was a little bitter, I think is true, right? And when she comes back to England, she comes back with vengeance, especially on this Protestant church. They call her Bloody Mary because she has a lot of people killed and executed, bishops and stuff. She would bring them out to the center of the town square and tell them to recant, and they'd say, we're not going to, and then she would have them executed. So she gets the nickname Bloody Mary because so many people died during her reign. She is married to the King of Spain, Philip. Her and Philip, by the way, when she becomes the Queen of England, and he is the king, they're not getting along. And by the way, they for many years they don't even see each other. He goes back to Spain and she stays in England, and they don't get along. Therefore, guess what? They don't have any children. So when she dies early, she dies within a few years. Guess who now becomes the queen? Elizabeth. Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman that Mary was exiled or whatever for, and then she was born, and so now Elizabeth becomes the queen. So, she will return things back to a Protestant view. So his half-sister Mary, who is Roman Catholic, rules for 5 years. Her name is AKA, also known as Bloody Mary. That's not Mary, that's Elizabeth. And then Elizabeth becomes queen now in 1558. But guess what? Some people claim that Elizabeth, especially the Roman Catholics, who were kind of in charge at the time, said Elizabeth can't be queen. Why? Her marriage is not, the marriage of her mother to the king was not endorsed by the Roman Catholic Church. Therefore, Elizabeth is illegitimate and Elizabeth cannot be the queen. And so they begin to challenge her and her legitimacy and her ability to be the queen. And so many of them begin to try to put up other people as possible heirs to the throne, including another Mary, who's called Mary, Queen of Scots. Yes. So, Elizabeth's reign, at least early on, is filled with a lot of the turmoil over the Protestant Catholic dilemma. Now, she returns to a Protestant view, but a far more moderated view of the Protestant church. Far more moderated, a middle-of-the-road approach. She tries to stabilize England. And so what she does is she lets some people within the Church of England be almost Catholics, sometimes called Anglo-Catholics. And then some of them are very Protestant. And she says, that's all right, we can have this sort of wide views within the Anglican Church of sort of being Catholic without the Pope and over here being as Protestant as Martin Luther or John Calvin. But that means she also didn't really satisfy either group. The Anglo-Catholics, those who wanted to be Roman Catholic, didn't like her. She was Protestant, and those who were very Protestant didn't like her because she wasn't Protestant enough. And a whole group of people are sort of conspiring to get her out of office by bringing forth St. Mary, Queen of Scots. She also has tensions with her former brother-in-law, I guess her brother-in-law, right? Philip. Philip had been married to Mary, and when Mary dies without an heir, and then Elizabeth comes to power that people say is illegitimate, Philip says, you know, Elizabeth, your sister and I didn't really get along, as you might know, Mary. But I think you and I could really hit it off. So what do you say you and me get hitched? We get this merger back together, this Spain and England thing. It could work for both of us. Elizabeth says no, very clearly. I don't want anything to do with you. That makes Philip very mad. Politically, I don't know, also, who knows, maybe emotionally, or romantic, I don't know. But anyway, he launches an armada. It's called the Spanish Armada, a huge fleet of ships to go and attack England, because basically he claims Elizabeth is not the true heir, and he, as the husband of the previous queen, has a duty to assure that England, has a proper monarch in place. And since she won't marry me, I'm going to come there and take it over. And so he sends an armada of ships in 1588, the Spanish Armada. They try to, they're going to launch an amphibious assault. They're going to bring ships in, land troops, and take over. Now what happens when these ships come, and by the way, Spain also controlled the Netherlands, so they could bring ships from the Netherlands and bring ships from Spain, and they're coming up to attack England. England didn't really have the great navy they would later, and so they were really outgunned, outmatched. Their ships were much smaller, but they did send out the English ships. The English ships were much more maneuverable. They would circle them. They would set ships on fire and sail them off into the mixture of the other. They did a lot of things. But the main thing that saved England, most people said, was what they called a Protestant wind. A big storm came up in the English Channel, and it blew the ships, the Spanish ships who were large and heavy, it blew them off course, and it blew them around into rocks. Some of them crashed into the rocks near this coast. Some of them had to sail all the way up and around England and come back through the Irish Sea. And so there were very few ships left, and they sailed back to Spain, and they gave up. And so the Spanish Armada never really landed. And a lot of them were destroyed by this great storm, which some people said was sent by God. A Protestant wind saved England. Well, a lot more to that story, but we got to leave it there because we got to keep moving. We always got to keep moving. Now let's talk about one more thing, and that's the Counter-Reformation, or sometimes called the Catholic Reformation. This is actually a movement launched by Roman Catholics from within the Roman Catholic Church to reform the Roman Catholic Church. One thing became clear is that there were problems with the Roman Catholic Church. Even the Roman Catholics admitted it. There had been corruption, like we talked about, remember, where there had been like dual offices, plurality. There had been the bidding out of church offices, simony. There had been a lot of corruption, so a lot of the popes were very corrupt and so forth. And so all of these things were seen as a problem, and the Roman Catholic Church couldn't really afford to ignore it, because now they've got a lot of competition. They got Lutherans, they got Reformed, they got Anabaptists, now they got the Church of England. So the Roman Catholic Church has taken it on the chin, so to speak. Right? So this is their counter move. They're going to reform themselves to try to hold the ground against the Protestants and perhaps try to regain some people, some territory back to the Roman Catholic way of thinking. This is launched roughly around the mid-16th century, around 1550, and it's called sometimes the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. One of the leaders of this is the guy pictured here. His name is Ignatius Loyola. Ignatius Loyola. Ignatius Loyola was an interesting guy. He starts an organization, monastic movement, called the Society of Jesus, or also known as the Jesuits. The Jesuits were known for very strict discipline and order. You might think of them, if you think about Catholic monks, you might think of these sort of being like the Marines of the Catholic monks, or the Navy SEALs. I mean, these guys were, there's monks and then there are monks. And these guys were like super monks. They were very loyal, and guess what? Ignatius Loyola turned out, he made a deal with the Pope that his monks would answer only straight to the Pope. They didn't have an abbot. They had nobody in between. They were there to serve the Pope directly. And the Pope, and certainly Ignatius, saw the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, as the first line of defense against the Protestants. To go out there and defend the Roman Catholic faith. And I think me calling him sort of in military terms is okay, because I think he would understand that, because Ignatius Loyola had been a military man. He had been a military man. And he brought a lot of the military kind of order into this monastic order. You know? If you're in the military, let's say, and you don't like what's going on with, let's say, your sergeant, you think you ought to call up the general or go into his office and say, hey, my sergeant's too tough on me? No! That's going to create even more problems. If you got trouble with your sergeant, you should take it up with your sergeant, or maybe the next immediate superior. But you don't jump up to a general or somebody else like that. That's the way he wanted this order. It's a hierarchy, and he wants the hierarchy for them to follow it. And he has strict order, strict military approach. Okay? He's going to bring that to this movement. Now, because of this, he begins to regain territory across Europe. One of the things that he writes, you can still read it, Ignatius Loyola, you can see it right here. This is a recent printing. I'm sure you can find it online for free. It's called Spiritual Exercises. And what Ignatius Loyola says, you know what? If you want to be strong spiritually, you need to work out spiritually. Now, if you go into the weight room and you go over to the bench press like 400 pounds your first day, all right? Probably going to be tough. But maybe you start with 100 pounds, you work up to 150 pounds, maybe you work up to 200 pounds. You know, you have to work at it. You've got to exercise yourself to get stronger in whatever it is you're doing. I'd say it's the same with your studies. You've got to exercise the brain up here. If you try to cram it all in, you don't do anything all semester, you got a flabby brain. And you come down to this time of year and you try to cram it all in there, you're going to have troubles. Right? You're going to have troubles. Well, anyway, he says it's the same with your spirituality, spiritual exercises. The Jesuits, he believes, should be highly educated, should be well-trained, and so he required all of them to make sure they knew how to read and write, they knew how to do all these things, and because of this, they began to travel all throughout Protestant Europe, trying to convince recently converted people to Protestantism that they really ought to come back to the true church, which in his opinion was the Roman Catholic Church. Come back to the true church. And because of this, they're able to regain parts of southern Germany and Poland for the Roman Catholic Church. And you know, two fairly recent previous popes, one of them was from Germany and another one was from Poland. In fact, the immediate past pope was from Germany, and the one before that, 2 popes back, was from Poland. We now, for the first time, have 2 popes, right? We got a retired pope, Pope Emeritus. He's the one from Germany. And so they have good success. So what we see now is, for example, in Spain, we never talk about a Protestant Reformation in Spain. Why? One of the things they had in Spain is they were very actively trying to stop the Protestants right from the beginning. Remember, Spain had a lot of Muslims that had lived there, a lot of Jews that had lived there, and because of that, they had developed the Inquisition. So when Protestants start showing up, they know how to handle them. And it's through a lot of violence and intimidation. It's called the Spanish Inquisition, created in Spain in medieval times to root out heresy. So you never see it, but some of these elements of the Spanish Inquisition are also brought into play in places like the Netherlands, with Spain controls, to try to root out Protestants there. So there was a concerted effort to reconvert Protestants back to Roman Catholic and to prevent new converts, and even to intimidate and even punish Protestants. Now, the Council of Trent takes place, as you can see, over a 20-year period. It doesn't mean they meet every day for 20 years, but over a 20-year period, they're discussing the Reformation and how to react to the Protestant Reformation. And I think the Protestants, the Lutherans and the Calvinists and others, were waiting to see what would happen. They saw some changes within the Roman Catholic Church, and they said, you know what? Maybe the Roman Catholic Church will actually want to change, and we can work something out. So they waited to see what would happen, what would be the outcome of the Council of Trent. But when the Council of Trent issues its statement, the Council of Trent basically says this: we're not changing anything. We're going to get rid of the corruption, yes, but we're not changing our church doctrine. We're not going with the Bible only, sola scriptura. We're going to be scripture and tradition. We're not getting rid of this, we're not adapting this sola fides, only faith. It's going to be faith and works. We're going to reaffirm the Pope as the ruler, and we're going to reaffirm all the traditional doctrines. So this is the Spanish Inquisition. Ever seen those guys? You probably didn't expect that, did you? I know I didn't. Anyway, so they reaffirm tradition plus scriptures. They also reaffirm this idea that there should be no private interpretation of scriptures. What does that mean? There's going to be an official interpretation by the church, and that's what you need to follow. By the way, you remember what Martin Luther had done? He had translated the Bible into German. Remember that? What do we call that? What do we call that language? It's the language of the people. What? Vernacular? Yeah, vernacular. The vernacular is just a word that means the language, the common language, the language of the people. And basically they're going to say no Bibles in the vernacular. The only Bible you can have is the Vulgate. That's the only Bible. And remember, the Vulgate's in Latin, and it was translated by Jerome hundreds of years earlier. That's the Bible, and that's it. We're not changing. So we're not changing language, we're not changing translations, we're not changing authority, we're not changing any of this stuff. We're keeping all of these things. And in fact, they even produced a list of books which you should not read. Prohibited books. Guess what? All the writings of Luther and Calvin are on there. You can rest assured, and lots of other things. And that basically means those should be destroyed, they should be outlawed, nobody should read them. No Roman Catholic should ever read anything by Martin Luther. they put them on a list that's called the index. So if the book was on the index, that means you shouldn't read it. Now, I got a feeling if I gave you a list today of books you shouldn't read, that's probably the only way I could get you to read something. Say, don't ever read this book. I'm going to find that book, find out why I shouldn't read it, and I'm going to read it. That's just human nature. But that's what happened here. All right, we're going to end there for today, and we will definitely start with the explorers and discovery on Thursday. You won't be here, but be watching YouTube for it. Remember the party on Friday. We'll see you then.